Welcome to the Commerce Tomorrow podcast, your one stop to learn about the technology that's powering the future of commerce. Here are your hosts, Dirk and Kelly.
Welcome to another episode of the Commerce Tomorrow podcast. I'm joined by my co-host, Dirk Horig.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining.
And today we're joined by David Robb. He's founder and CEO of the Customer Data Platform Institute. Welcome.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Before we get started, can you talk a little bit about your personal background and your life as an independent consultant?
Sure. So my background started out as a legitimate marketer back in the day, doing direct mail for magazines and continuities. After a few years of doing that, I switched over to the life of an independent consultant. Most of my career has been spent helping marketers to find either software companies or service companies that were providing services like database development and what later became marketing technology. More recently, 3 years ago, I founded the Customer Data Platform Institute, having actually named the term Customer Data Platform back in 2013. And the Institute is something that's designed to just help educate the industry about how to do a good job with their customer data. And that often does lead to customer data platforms, which are a class of software that I think we'll talk about a little later. So it's all been a long career of helping marketers make better use of the technology. And the technology changes, but the problems are kind of not that different.
Maybe tell us a little bit more about the CDP Institute, so Customer Data Platform Institute, what it's doing and what roles does it serve and how is it set up?
Okay, sure. So the Institute is essentially a trade association for the CDP vendors. It was founded, as I say, about 3 years ago now, when a couple of the vendors came to me and said, we're getting a lot of interest in this concept of a customer data platform. It's a category that you named and have been talking about a lot for the past few years before that. So you're the obvious person to do that. So I didn't want to work for any one vendor. We said, well, let's get all the vendors together and have them sort of fund some basically market development so that we can explain the concept of CDPs to people, because back then people didn't really understand even what it was, and then develop some standards around it and just elaborate on the ideas underneath it and help people to understand how to use them, what they're for, how they fit into the larger scheme of your other technologies. So, there's with any new category of software, there's just a lot of education that's required for people to take advantage of it. So that's been the mission of the Institute, is just to say, hey, here's this great tool. Why don't you figure out what problems it solves for you? Because it's not for everyone, but it's something that's available and can make your life easier. So let's see how we can help people to take advantage of
it. And what is a CDP?
Okay. So the official CDP Institute definition is a customer data platform is packaged software that builds a unified, persistent customer database that's accessible to other systems. So just breaking that apart a little. Packaged software means it's something that you buy. It's not a data warehouse that your IT department builds for you, or that you go out and you hire, an agency to build for you. So that's a lot quicker and usually cheaper to buy something than to build it. Unified persistent customer database means a few things, but it means that we take data in from all sources, not just any one source. It means that we keep all the details, so you don't have to go back and kind of hit yourself on the head because you forgot to store something it turns out that you needed. It means that it's all pulled together in a customer profile, so you get a complete view of each customer. And then the accessible to other systems just means that the data is shareable, because there are a lot of systems actually that'll build a customer database, but only sort of for their own purposes. So a predictive modeling system might assemble customer data, but then just use it to build predictive models. And that leads you to have, many different customer databases. It's much more efficient, obviously, to have one customer database that all your other systems can work from.
And what type of data would you put into a CDP, customer data? And what explicitly would you not put into a CDP?
Well, in theory, you could put in pretty much any data that relates to customers that you want. Usually there is a requirement that the data that be entered has some flavor of a customer ID on it, which could be an anonymous ID like a cookie ID, but it should be related to a customer. So you wouldn't store your manufacturing data in there. It just doesn't relate to customers. But, customer data includes data from your CRM system, includes data from your e-commerce system, includes data from your customer service. It could include data from your shipping and your order processing. So there's a lot of places that companies gather customer data that are all in different systems. And again, that's the whole purpose of the CDP, is to bring that all together in one place, so that you can then get a complete view of what you've done to that customer and decide going forward what's the best next thing to do for each person.
And beside that unified view on that customer, and you have all that data from different kind of sources aggregated, is it mainly just then to be able to deliver that data, or does it also go beyond when you think about things on personalization, analytics, combination with other data sources? So where is the use case ending?
Right. Well, that's a great question. And it's actually, sadly, a little confusing because different CDPs end in different places. Some CDPs just assemble the data and make it available to other systems. Some CDPs do that, plus do analytics like predictive modeling or machine learning, or attribution, other kinds of advanced analytics. They all do segmentation, incidentally. Some CDPs do the data assembly, plus the analytics, plus the personalization, at least to the extent of deciding which message is the best message for which person. You usually traditionally have kind of drawn the line and said that's about the scope of a broad CDP. What's happening now is there are systems that are, say, delivery systems like web content management or email systems or even e-commerce systems that have decided that they also will build a unified persistent customer database that ticks all the boxes to do what a CDP does. So we would think of those as at least having a CDP inside of a larger system. And in fact, it even goes further, even some of the operational systems as well. Things like an order processing system, say, sometimes have the entire suite of capabilities, and they might have a CDP inside as well. So you can find a CDP that only builds the data, or you can find a CDP that does personalization. Which you buy really, of course, just depends on what you need.
And it seems that every platform out there, whether, like you said, whether it's an ERP or commerce platform, everyone forever has offered a single view of the customer, right? And they try to hoard as much data as they possibly can. But you can't have 5 enterprise systems all having a single view of the customer, right? How fundamentally different, how is the CDP different, I guess?
Well, that's the whole thing, right? So they all offer a single view of the customer, but usually they offer a single view of the data that they have gathered about that customer, the data that they have generated through their own internal operations about the customer. So the CRM knows everything that customer has done through the CRM, and the order processing system knows everything about the orders that customer placed, but they don't know anything about what the marketing automation system sent out. Okay, so the difference is, and they're really not built to ingest the data from those other sources. So even though they might sort of on some level know that it would be useful to present that, they're usually not designed to do that. And if you're not designed out of the box to do that, it's really very, very difficult to make a system change its data structure to add in external data, for example. So what's different about the CDP is, again, it was designed specifically for that purpose. The CDP, by and large, doesn't actually generate its own data. It doesn't send out emails. It doesn't process orders. It doesn't support customer service interactions and keep a record of it. It just pulls data from all those systems. It's designed to handle any kind of input. It's designed to then, as I say, to bring it all together with the unification and to present that really comprehensive profile. So that's a pretty big difference, even though other systems may think about having a single customer view from a much really narrower perspective.
Is the specifics in the data model also the main differentiation between a DMP, so a data management platform, to a CDP?
Well, every system is designed for a purpose. And DMPs are basically designed to do advertising audiences, and they're really, at least originally, were designed primarily to manage cookies. That's what they did. You got a bunch of cookies, you put them in your DMP, and then if you wanted to select an audience of cookies that had attributes attached to them that said, oh, these people were in this region or in market to buy a car or in this income group or interested in politics, whatever the attributes associated with that particular cookie were, you then pull out an audience of those similar cookies and then you would send it off to receive ads or to bid against for programmatic. So that's a very specific requirement. It means you have a particular file structure technically that's basically a big flat file that has a cookie and a bunch of attributes associated with that cookie. So you have to summarize data, for example. So you would never store all of the specific individual purchase transactions in a DMP. That takes a different structure with multiple data layers in it. DMP is not designed for that. It couldn't really do its job very well if it did, because that's a relatively slow kind of data to analyze. So you design a DMP to have summary data and to access that summary data very quickly. Again, it's a very different use case than the CDP use case of storing all those details. So if you want to find out, who bought a cat mug on Tuesday at 3 a.m., you can find those transactions. The DMP won't have that level of detail.
Got it. That makes a lot of sense. So all new technology is adopted according to basically the Gartner hype cycle, right? Where you start with a trigger, you have peak of inflated expectations, trough of disillusionment, slope of enlightenment, and then plateau of productivity, right? Where is CDPs in this cycle today?
Well, CDP has actually been at the peak of the hype cycle for, I think, the last 3 years now. Maybe the first year we were just approaching it, but we're now just, if you look, and I happen to think Gartner is pretty accurate in where they place us, and we're still at the peak, but we're just about to enter the trough. So we're just on the border of that, and that's about right. Again, the concept has been quite popular for 3 years now, which is about as long as you're going to stay at that peak. And people now understand it, and they're beginning to ask the next set of questions, which is, well, no, not what is it, which is really the question, or how do I use it, which is the question you get when you're at the peak. But okay, I understand it, but now maybe I have some experience, or my friends do, and it doesn't do everything, which is why you end up in that trough of disillusionment. So let me learn how to really use it. So there's that plateau of I forget what they call it, productivity, where you kind of learn what a technology really is good for and it's not so good for, and you kind of learn how to use it effectively. So we're just entering that stage where people are beginning to ask the question, not what is it, but how do I use it best? And that's, it's a good place to be. It's obviously a little scary to know that you're going to start hearing the horror stories, but that's just part of the cycle. Normal thing, happens to every technology. So we just know it's coming, and we're sort of getting, ourselves sort of girded for that. But we really are focusing on, okay, guys, yeah, it's not perfect, so you have to learn how to use it well. And, it's not going to solve all your problems. Nobody ever said it would, but everybody just sort of hopes that this will be the one silver bullet. Well, no, CDP is not going to be that silver bullet either.
I have a practical question on that, David. So let's say I decided for CDP and I want to integrate that into my system. Let's assume it's a commerce platform fitting to that podcast. In the case, for example, a customer is placing an order. How does that data get into the CDP? Is it directly pulled? Is it frequently on a job basis? How does a typical integration of systems look like?
So there's a couple ways it can happen. In terms of how quickly the data gets in, if the e-commerce system can stream that data in real time, through an API or whatever, then the CDP can ingest that. A lot of e-commerce systems are going to push that out, in a batch once a night or something. So the CDP will take it in a batch. It may go directly to the CDP, but a lot of companies already have a data lake or a data warehouse where that data is being fed. And if it's more convenient to pull the data from that source rather than having a second direct line into the e-commerce system, you can do it that way. That's actually a pretty common way to do things. So, the CDPs, again, just their whole design goal was to be flexible. So it's pretty much whatever way you want and whatever way you're capable of pushing the data in, the CDP should be able to accept it that way. So it'll really depend on what you can do, but ideally it comes in streaming, because then you have an up to the minute view of your customers, and nearly all CDPs can handle that real time processing.
Do people build or buy CDPs, or I guess what's the breakdown there, and what types of companies typically build versus buy?
Well, again, by definition, the CDP is packaged software, so it's something that you buy. You could build your own system that does what a CDP does. We wouldn't call it a CDP, but you might, when you're drawing your architecture diagram, have a box that says CDP on it. So you have to distinguish between the class of systems of software and the functionality. Some companies do build the equivalent of a CDP. Again, is it all that different from a data warehouse or a data lake? There are some differences in terms of, usually data warehouses are limited to structured data. A data lake will have unstructured data, but a data lake usually doesn't do quite some of the processing, the unification that a CDP would do. But could you build something that creates a unified persistent view of the customer that's accessible to other systems? Yeah, big companies often want to do that. They have the technical resources to make that possible. They often have a data lake to start from, so they've kind of gotten halfway there anyway. It really, like any other build-buy decision, just becomes a question of, can I best use my limited development resources, and every company's resources are limited no matter how big they are, and build this tool for myself? Or, since there are actually plenty of perfectly good pieces of packaged software, is it more effective for me to buy that package and use my development resources to create something that I really can't buy on the market? So, if your needs are really unique, and you need just something so special in a CDP that the existing CDPs don't actually support it, or would take very configuration, it might make more sense to build it. Otherwise, we think in the vast majority of cases, it makes more sense to buy it, but there are for sure people who want to go out and build it.
Are there some vendors, so good, solid, modern CDP platforms that you could mention?
Well, I can mention a lot of them. The Institute, there's about 100 or so in the world. About 50 of them are participants in the Institute. So, of course, I get a little cranky.
Is it all feature USPs that they have, or is it geographical differences?
Again, there are different scopes of the products. So there are some that really just focus on the data assembly. So a Telium or a Treasure Data might be a good example of one that really, they're really good at gathering data and assembling it and building the database, and they don't try to get much beyond that. Some of the other ones that have like advanced analytics, I was just on the phone with NG Data, a few minutes ago, so we'll just mention them as one that has good analytics capability. Then there are other ones that do the personalization, so a Lytics or a Blue Conic or a Redpoint or a BlueVen. Again, there's many of them, and they're all my friends, so I try to mention as many as possible here. So they all have different scopes.
And we can make some advertising, right? For everybody who's interested in it, so go to the website. Exactly. It's CDPinstitute.org, there you find a link. It's called directory, right? And in the directory, you have the whole vendor catalog.
Yeah, and the directory just actually has both sponsors and non-sponsors in it. So we just try to list all 100 that we know about, because we try to be as fair as we can. And again, and then there are some regional ones, like that only sell in Europe, or only sell in the US, or only sell in Asia. So that's another kind of way that people decide who to look at. And there's some industry specialists too. NG Data, again, who just happens to be top of mind, is really just financial services. There's a couple others who are, just travel or just healthcare or whatever, or specialists in retail and so on.
So, just a quick technical question. So, CDP's taken lots and lots of data from many different sources, right? And a lot of the click captures and all the anonymous data, the e-commerce data, right? That ends up being a lot of data, right? Terabytes and terabytes potentially. How do these solutions actually cope with all of that data? Like, what are the underlying technologies that they use to scale?
Most of them are using the pretty standard sort of big data, Hadoop, Mongo, Cassandra, the same tools that everybody else uses. There's a couple who have some proprietary data management technology, and that's usually for in-memory to get really high speed as opposed to the high volume that the big data, the standard big data stuff does quite well. And some of them will sit on, Redshift or Google BigQuery, the cloud databases as well, scale really well. So it's not so much that data storage capability, which again is kind of the same thing you'd use for a data lake. It's the additional processing on top of that they've built in. That's more where the additional development has been done, is to take those raw tools that anybody can buy and put together the packages and the processes and the data flows that make them useful, which again, is something that you could develop for yourself if you had the resources, but it often makes way more sense to leverage the work of someone who's already done it rather than to try to reinvent that wheel.
Understand. So I need to play the German here a little bit in this podcast episode, talking about GDPR, customer data privacy protection. There's in Europe we have GDPR. There's a Californian Privacy Act now more or less in place, and everywhere in the world, customer data privacy initiatives are raising. What precautions do I need to take to comply with them? What do I need to consider and to look at when I implement a CDP?
Well, GDPR is great for CDPs. It was like the biggest gift they've had, at least in the European market, because what you need to do to comply with GDPR is to figure out where all your customer data is, either pull it together in one place or at least put in connectors that link it together virtually, analyze it, be able to change it if you need to change it. So those are all the things that you kind of need to do to make a CDP useful, or that a CDP does. So complying with GDPR often requires a CDP to do it well, because the CDP does exactly what GDPR wants you to do. You obviously have to then make sure that you're tracking consent and that you are accepting whatever requests you're getting for data access or for data dropping out the data. I forget the technical term. So which would happen not just in the CDP, although the CDP would have its own copy of data. So if someone says delete my data, you'd have to delete it from the CDP, but you also have to go out to the source systems and delete it as well. But the CDP knows what those source systems are because it's getting the data from them in the first place. So it gives you that roadmap that says go back and, okay, make sure you delete it in all these other 16 places. It's actually extremely helpful to the CDP vendors to have people looking around saying, wow, how can I do what GDPR wants me to do? And the answer is often, well, a CDP will make that way easier.
I think we in software have gotten lucky over the past couple of years that there hasn't been more regulation. But, I expect GDPR and this new California law and others, it wouldn't surprise me if there's something at the federal level at some point. It's good that CDPs can help out with that challenge. I think it's going to be the standard.
Yep. I mean, at the end of the day, you're going to have to do what a CDP does. So whether you build it yourself or you buy a CDP, it's just a business decision.
Yeah. A tactical question for you, since this is a podcast focused on the intersection of commerce and technology, how can commerce platforms use CDPs to provide better personalization? Do you have any tactical tips and tricks?
Yeah, well, one of the big advantages and one of the primary commerce use cases specifically for CDP is to get the data in from across channels. So if you are, for example, a bricks and clicks retailer and you have your POS data over here with your physical retail sales, and you have your e-commerce system over there with your online sales, you often want to look at those together so you can understand completely what this customer is buying in both channels, and then tailor your offers appropriately. Another big use case in e-commerce is getting the CRM system that your customer service people are using to be able to see what's going on in the e-commerce system, because those are not always connected to each other, but certainly you want to make sure that your customer service agents can see that data, and also can see not just the history of the purchases, which usually will get available, but also the browsing and the drop shopping carts and all the other stuff that doesn't necessarily get copied across in real time. The CDP often acts as a translation layer or an integration layer to make sure that the CRM system has that complete view of the customer that otherwise would not be available. Beyond that, the CDPs that have predictive capabilities obviously can be used for recommendations and targeting and segmentation. Again, bringing in broader data than you would have available simply if you looked at what was captured in the e-commerce system alone. So it's that whole the core CDP use case is taking data from multiple systems and unifying it and making it available. And if you think about that, there's just a million very specific things that you can do once you've done that unification.
Yeah, I'll bet the whole emergence of the streaming ecosystem, if you look at AWS and GCP and Azure, they all have streaming data platforms. Mm-hmm. I'll bet that's been great for this whole industry. And I know in the commerce space that we're very aggressively using event streaming to provide more real-time personalization and things like that. So good to hear. All right. With that, I wanted to thank you for speaking with us about CDPs. Thought it was a very interesting discussion. Any final thoughts?
Only people really do need to think through where their gaps are when we talk about use cases for CDPs. And as I say, that's sort of the question that comes up now. It's like, well, what can't you do? And what's stopping you from doing it? And if it's lack of unified data that's stopping you from doing it, that makes you a prime prospect for a CDP.
Great. And where can people learn more about CDPs?
Again, cdpinstitute.org is the best place to go. There's a huge library of papers and directory of vendors and newsletters and videos and just all kinds of good stuff on there that, again, is all vendor neutral. It's just intended to help marketers do a better job. I've been doing that my whole life, and I intend to do it for the rest of my life.
Very good. Well, thanks again for joining us. Very much appreciate your time, and take care.
Great. My pleasure.